This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thank you, Bonnie. Well, hello, Ocala. It's great to be here. So as Bonnie said, what I'm going to try and talk to you about today is how many have gone to the doctor's office and heard the words, well, it's my experience. That's what you hear, right? What I'm going to tell you today is what if we could combine every doctor's experience into one source, and so it's not only that doctor's experience, it's all their experience. That's what we're trying to do, okay? And so we're going to use data science to combine all the experiences of physicians taking care of patients, but we do it through the patient. This is a partnership with patients. Nothing happens in our system until the patient says, you may study me. And that's the way it works. So I just told you in 3 minutes what I'm going to talk about. All right. So this is, as you just heard from Bonnie, the usual disclosures. But since I'm here in Florida, I get to tell you my real disclosures. That's my backyard. And Floridians, this is what we have to truly tell other people, right? You better be careful. All right. So, as I just said, what if in society we could build a healthcare system that would actually predict what you may be at risk for developing in terms of illness, but also predict what you may respond to, what therapies may actually work for you versus someone else. And the only way we can do that is by studying as many people as we can and begin to recognize what we call patterns. In other words, what's happening throughout their life in dealing with a disease. And so we're going to start with cancer, because that's the only disease I understand and take care of. But we believe that what we're talking about with cancer and the approach that we take to learn can be applied to any healthcare issue. That's where we're going. And I use the word learn. This is all about learning. And we're doing this with patients' partnership. And you're dealing it with doctors who've agreed we want to share our experience and study and basically combine every physician's experience. So in so doing, we believe we'll be able to predict responses. And this is what we mean by reactive to proactive. By being able to study patients and follow them, we can begin to see patterns in the data science that says, given this patient's history, we think this is what's next, what event may occur next, such as a recurrence of cancer. What if, instead of waiting for the disease to come back and then working them up and trying to figure out what you're going to do, you can start anticipating this patient's at risk for developing progressive disease, and from every patient that looks like this patient, here's what we've learned. And now you create options before they need it. So we're anticipating need and creating options. That's the proactive part. That's where we're going. Now, it is a journey. And we're calling it personalized healthcare. It's personalized because if a patient develops a specific cancer, say lung cancer, and the pathologist looks at it under the microscope, it looks like lung cancer. And they look at another patient's lung cancer, it looks exactly like the other person's. So under a microscope, all lung cancer basically looks the same. But in fact, they're very different. Each patient's disease is unique. It's like your fingerprint, right? Your fingerprint is unique. Unfortunately, so is a cancer. It's that unique. And so by being able to understand similarities, we can begin to predict, and by predicting, we can create personalized therapy. So that's what we mean by personalized, is understanding the nuance, the uniqueness of each patient so that we can give them the best therapy that works for them. Hence, we use the term personalized. So how do we get there from there? Well, the last one is not an option. We're not going to forget about it. But it is a road. It's a journey. And while we've been talking about personalized medicine, say, for the last decade as something that's new, in fact, it began over 100 years ago with Mendel. You know, Mendel, the Austrian monk who studied plants, was the first one to actually determine the uniqueness that was inherited through genes. That's when all of this started, over 100 years ago, by a monk in Austria who liked to garden. And he came up with, I'm seeing this inherited response, and you could predict it. So he came up with the term genes. So you're going to see this evolution that's occurring. Now the idea, everybody has what we call the genome. You each have a genome. That's the entirety of your genes. You have about 28,000 genes in your body. Now, and it's made up like alphabets, so it has letters. And if we were to study every gene in you, it would generate so much data that the New York telephone book would be your genome. That's how much data we're talking about that we need to study. And that's just one part of your uniqueness. So think of yourself as, boy, that's a lot of letters. And how many of us are here? So we each have our own telephone book, and one way to look at that. So it's the genome. And in 1990, they came up with the idea, let's sequence a genome and see what we can learn. It took 13 years to sequence, in other words, understand the first genome at $3.5 billion. 13 years, and this was 1990 to 2003. $3.5 billion. Today, we can sequence a human genome in a week for about $1,000. That's what's happened in 15 years. So this is a rapidly growing period of science, which we call genomics. It's fascinating, but we need to harness this information, this capability now of understanding the uniqueness of everybody's New York telephone book, right? So each letter. And we can do that. We can generate the data. But that's not enough. What we have to be able to do is say, how many people look similar and how many are different? And so we're going to come up with this ability to look at degrees of similarity so we can predict. And by being able to predict, we can be proactive. You know, folks know Hippocrates. Everybody know Hippocrates, essentially the first doc, right? Well, Hippocrates, and this is in the Greek islands, would do what physicians do today. Patient comes in and says, I don't feel good. He would examine you, and based on his experience, would say, I think you have appendicitis. And so physicians react to a presentation that a patient comes in with complaints, that we react to that complaint. If you have cancer, we'll diagnose it, but we don't want to have to wait for you to progress to create options. So what if we could predict that we think this patient's at risk, and rather than wait for them to progress and then try to figure out their options, we could say, look, this patient looks like this group of patients that came before this individual, and this is what we're learning, and create options for that patient before they need it. So anticipate, create options is the best approach. You don't want to wait till you already have the problem. Anticipate the problem, right? That's where we need to go with medicine. Anticipate, proactive. All right, so you heard Bonnie say we developed this alliance. This is a partnership. You almost never see this, by the way, of scientists coming in and saying, you know, scientists are as competitive as anybody. In fact, the system's broken, I'll just tell you, in terms of academia, because you're judged on your contribution, on your success, when in fact what we should be doing is judging the team. How well do you collaborate? The more eyes we have looking at things and brains thinking about things, we'll probably explore more and discover more, right? Teamwork. That's where medicine needs to go. And it's beginning to happen. Because every cancer center now is starting to realize, I don't care how many patients you see, it isn't enough. But what if we were to pool all the patients together and everybody's looking at them and studying them and then talking about what they're seeing? That's collaborative science. That's team science. That's ORIEN. So oncology, research, information, exchange, network. That's how we came up. Now we know that is a misspelling of the constellation. I know that. I'm always told, you guys can't spell. It's ORION. Well, I couldn't make exchange out of an O, so it's ORIEN. All right, these are our guiding principles. 1, collaborate. Again, team science. 2, we need to make this data that we're generating accessible to as many eyes and minds as we can. 3, inclusiveness. We think any patient anywhere should have access to what we're building, not just at cancer centers, but at communities as well. That is our goal. And by the way, what I'm about to tell you, a patient never pays for any of this. We have pharmaceutical companies, we have other stakeholders that will pay for this. This is research. You don't pay a patient who's allowing you to study them, right? You don't charge them. So inclusiveness, and then private-public partnership. So the different businesses can come together, learn, and then benefit the patient and society. So these are our 4 guiding principles of ORIEN. Our foundation is this. You see the word protocol. That tells you straight away this is research. You're seeing total cancer care. A little presumptuous perhaps, but the idea is, what if we could understand by following patients who donate all their data and tissue for us to study and learn, what if we could understand and predict need, okay? And by using this data, meet that need. So we want to understand the totality of a patient. By the way, the obvious need of a newly diagnosed patient is what's the best therapy. But as a patient dealing with cancer, they have other needs, psychosocial needs, economic needs, and we are developing tools to measure that as well. And what if we could predict a psychosocial event in a patient with cancer or their family? Maybe we could intervene to prevent a psychosocial malady, right? That's the totality that we want to ultimately have and exist. So again, you heard me say, nothing happens until the patient says, you have my permission to study me. So that's how this all begins. So this is a partnership with patients, and we ask them, may we follow you throughout your lifetime and learning about what your needs are. So the need of a patient say who's newly diagnosed is quite different than a survivor. At new diagnosis, it's what's the best therapy? And do I have the right diagnosis? Okay? The survivor is dealing with not only the consequences of having cancer, but the consequences of the therapy. So that those are new sets of needs. That's why we need to study these patients and people throughout their lifetime to try to identify their needs. And then by following these patients, generating all this data, that's creating evidence. What worked for whom? So that with that evidence, we can meet the need based on all the people that preceded them and look like them. How you doing, Ron? Good. And ultimately, what if we could predict need? That's where we want to be. Predict need. Don't wait for something to happen that the patient needs you and needs options. Don't wait for that to happen. Understand them, be able to predict, and then create options before they need it. That's total cancer care. So where are we today? This began at, that's why I showed those Florida slides, right? This began in Florida, folks. This didn't begin in Boston. Nothing against Boston, but this began in Florida. And at Moffitt Cancer Center 13 years ago. It is now in 19 different cancer centers throughout the United States, all adopting the same protocol, same consent, same process, and agree to share. So it's what started at 1, in 4 years, 19 centers, and more in the line to join. So the physicians want to do this. They want to share, and they want to learn from each other. It's actually exhilarating. But this takes a cultural change to make it happen. But what I'm witnessing is that type of cultural change, willingness to share and collaborate. And as you can see, we now have over 227,000 patients in this system. It's a lot, but not big enough. Now that we have 19 centers, we're enrolling approximately 600 new patients a week. We want it to be thousands. In other words, I showed you our guiding principles: inclusivity, accessibility. If a patient has cancer, we think they should be offered the opportunity. And by the way, we formed a patient advocacy group to help us. These are patients dealing with cancer, and they've told us what they want. You know what they want? They want that same information we're generating about them. And they want to know, how many people look like me? And by the way, what are you learning from people that look like me? And with that learning, what kind of questions should I be asking my physician based on the learnings of people that look like me? Those are patients telling us that. So we are now developing their portal to go into the data warehouse that we've built so they can look at patients like them and learn from them. They learn they're not alone, and they know that we're beginning to learn to create options. It's exciting for them, and they insist on it, as they should. So I'm proud of this. This is coast to coast. I do want to point out Moffitt Cancer Center. As you can see, it's near the DC area. Do you folks know what Moffitt Cancer Center? That is Walter Reed Hospital. This is the entire largest military hospital in the United States joined ORIEN. They are forming a network of all the military bases in the United States to enroll patients into this system. So the active military has joined this because they want their patients to receive the very best as well and through learning. And we are in discussions with the VA. So the active military to the veteran status, so that there is a continuous follow-up. I'm very excited about this. Craig Shriver, just to plug him, is the Cancer Center Director. Colonel Shriver at Walter Reed is fabulous, and he's building this network throughout the active military. So it's happening, needs to happen faster. Again, here's where we're going though. So all the centers, all the participants, same protocol, same consent, same data collection, and now sharing the data because we've built the data warehouse to make that happen so they can start to look at it. And what we're looking for are patterns. What pattern may predict an event such as progressive disease? Well, the more we learn about those patterns, we can start saying, look, this patient's starting to develop this pattern. And based on that, we should be looking at what their options are in anticipation of need. So if nothing else, it's going from reactive to proactive. Now, the patients with greatest need are patients who unfortunately aren't cured with the standard of therapy, be it surgery and or chemotherapy. And their disease, for various reasons, have mechanisms in the tumor that become resistant to the therapy. Those patients, in our mind, have the greatest need. And so they need a clinical trial. They need something that's beyond the standard of care. So we have chosen within ORIEN as our primary goal at this point is to find trials for patients who are likely to progress on standard of therapy. Again, you don't want to wait for them to progress and then start working them up. That's not the time to be working them up. We need to have worked them up in anticipation and created options for them before they need it. And that's where we can actually do that now. And so we look at it, you have trials seeking patients, and which is good. The trials are there, but there's a new form of therapy. It's called target-based therapy. It's through the genetics and genomics that we can actually define a particular target in a patient's tumor. That's a molecule that's abnormal. It's not in the patient's normal cells. That target is only in the tumor cell. But we have to discover this entire genome to find it, okay? But that's what we're doing. So we're looking for targets in the tumor that make it unique. And once we find the target, then we develop a drug in combination with pharmaceutical companies to hit that target, okay? But if you have patients, say, with breast cancer, and 10% have the target, well, you got to find those 10%, all right? And what we want to do is find them before they need it. We know they have the unique target, so then they become potentially eligible for that trial. I hope you see this is all about anticipation. And then you have patients seeking trials. So we're working from both sides. So, the academic in me has to show you a paper, right? We've written on how we do this. And what's important for you to we can do this prospectively. In other words, we're examining the data, and we start finding these options before they need it. We are anticipating, and it works. So we have found trials for patients before they need them, and when they go on trial, they have a greater chance of responding because they had the target. All right? So that's the last paper you'll see me. No, it's not. All right, this is the backbone. We call it the patient's avatar. You're familiar with the avatar, right? So how many people really look like me? The fancy term is in silico community. Well, that doesn't sound as cool as avatar, so we call it avatar. But so as I mentioned, patients all look different, and that's what you're looking at over here on in the population, different colors, if you will. What if we then start studying them, looking at them clinically, what the events are, looking at their molecular background, their genotype, their genes, and then by looking at the longitudinal data, we start forming communities. And that's why each population you see there, I think that's red, blue, and green, that is a population that looks like, one patient looks like that population. Okay? So that's their in silico community, that's their avatar. We're learning from each population. Some are responding to therapy, others aren't. It's by forming these avatars, these patients like them, that allows us to learn from that population and then predict. So we need to grow this immensely so that we can get more and more refined in each patient's avatar. And when we explain this to patients, they get excited about this. So this is the community that looks like me. And the first question is, what are you learning? So that website I was talking about, we're going to tell them what we're learning from patients like them and how we think it might help them should they need it. That's what that website will be doing. So this is, again, it's just the example. Newly diagnosed, the patient consents. Yes, you may follow me. Yes, you may study my tumor to look for different targets. When you find those targets, tell me the different trials I am eligible for should I need it, and this is an anticipation. The patient may never need the trial at all, but wouldn't it be better to know if you did, these are the trial options you have? It'd be great if you never needed it, but if you did, we've got them. That's where we're going. But this is going to take a great deal of collaboration. Okay, this is the last paper. This is a specific trial where we use the system of the avatar, and it was for a new drug that hit a very specific target in patients with stomach cancer and pancreatic cancer. Now that target is only in about 5% of patients with stomach or pancreatic cancer. So if you're a patient with one of those diseases and then the disease progresses, trying to find 5%, 5 out of 100 that might benefit from this trial, working them up when they've already progressed, that's not the time to do it. So what we're doing is working them up for all those trials, and we already know who the 5 are. And those 5 can go on trial. And that's what this study showed. We were able to find the patients, put them on trial faster, and improve their chances because we anticipated. So, and I promise that's the last paper. So again, this is the one slide that tells you the entire story, right? Going from reactive to proactive. And we're going to do this. These little silos, these little cones down here are individual cancer centers. And they tend to function as individual cancer centers. But what they've agreed to do is let's use the same protocol and ask patients if we can study them. And then everybody pulls them, and that's where the data goes, right? So, and we're developing different ways of recognizing patterns so that we can predict need and then use the evidence that's being generated to meet that need. Let me give you an example. Now, most oncologists aren't molecular biologists. I mean, there's only so much they can do. They're seeing patients every day, right? So they don't always know what's available immediately. What if a doc in Ocala sees a new patient? It's a unique cancer, maybe a rare cancer. That doctor can enroll the patient in the system and say, how many patients in the database, in the total cancer care database, look like the one I'm seeing today? So the clinical data, the age of the patient, the gender of the patient, the race, ethnicity, other illnesses, other medications they're taking, all that kind of data goes into the system. And the genetics are performed. So we say, all right, excuse me. This is a warning to stop talking. So the doc in Ocala said, all right, I've got the patient in the system. This is what they look like. Here's their genetics. How many people in the database look like the patient I'm seeing today? We can find that population. This is that patient's avatar. What were the treatments used for this patient population? We give the various treatments being used. What were the responses and outcomes for each treatment? Now that doc has in my experience, of all the patients that were in the system before that patient. All right? So we're learning from the population, and we can give the doc at the point of care, this is your patient's population, here's what that population was treated with, this appears to work best. And you're not just looking at one paper, right, maybe with 500 patients, we're looking at hundreds of thousands of patients, right? So the level of evidence is that much greater. Now, this is a journey, folks. This is beginning, but it truly is beginning, and it is launching. And so you can understand, I hope, now going from reactive to proactive medicine. So when you leave here and you go to Boston, you can say, are you doing reactive or proactive medicine, right? And oh, by the way, I'm from Ocala, where we use data science. And we have the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition. Okay, so as I just mentioned, the docs have access to this data system. Our patients have told us we want access to this too. So this is in process of being built. The physician and research portal is built. It's working. The patient portal should be launched within the next few months. And we're building it in the advice of the patient advocates that I'll show you in a moment. They're telling us how they want this data presented. And not every patient wants to know everything. So we can't assume and just do a data dump on a patient when they don't want to know everything. So we need to respect the uniqueness of the desire of each patient as well, okay? Our patients are telling us that. So, but this is important because when, say, a patient is progressing, now this has happened. I have a patient that comes to me, I'm seeing them for the first time, their disease may be progressing. They come and hand me a stack of pages from Google and said, I've done my research, and what are you going to do? And so I'm spending 90% of my time telling them, this isn't appropriate, doesn't fit you. In this system, the patient and the physician are looking at the same data. So you're not dealing with this Google approach. You're looking at patients that look like my patient. And you're talking about options by looking at the same data. Wouldn't that help? So everybody's on the same page. That's what we're doing here in this, what we call evidence-based medicine at point of care. But it can't be just the doc. It has to be the doc working with a patient, and they're both looking at the same information. So I'm excited about this. Again, our patients, are, in addition to consenting, are answering questionnaires. They're giving us advice, but they're telling us what they're feeling. And we have a patient questionnaire, which has family history, other illnesses, other medications, and different psychosocial topics. This is our advisory board. Excuse me. They've allowed me to show you their names and pictures. This is one of the most active groups. We talk to them every month. We have a teleconference. We meet with them face-to-face for a day, twice a year. This group, I have never had to ask them, what do you think? I don't have to. They're going to tell me. And I just wanted to highlight the importance, because frankly, we don't think of everything, I can guarantee you. And they have a unique perspective that needs to be considered. This is what they've told us they want. So it's going to be called ORIEN, totalcancercare.org, tcc.org. And this is what they want to be taught. They want to know, again, what are you learning from my patients, from my avatar, and what questions should I be asking? Learn more about my cohorts. And actually, I also said, so these are for patients that are already in the system. These are for patients that have signed the Total Cancer Care consent. What if you live in Tucumcari, New Mexico? I'm from New Mexico, I get to do this. That's kind of isolated and may not be close to the latest academic center. Well, that patient in Tucumcari, New Mexico wants to be in this too, but they shouldn't have to travel 600 miles to do it. So what we're starting, and this is with the permission of reviewers as well as patients, is the ability to go to the internet and that patient in Tucumcari consent themselves through the internet. So we've had our first approvals to do that. This is the inclusivity that I was speaking of, that we need to be able to do. And we need to be able to deliver this at the point of care. And this is where IHMC is tremendous in developing these kind of tools for interface. So the doc that's seeing a patient or the patient themselves, you know, they're not going to be have this what they want to be able to do is, okay, this is what, if you're a doc, my patient's progressing, they're in the system, what trials are available for this patient and eligible? And you want to be able to do it on this. And we've developed a beta phase to do it. So it's being tested. And patients want that as well. So we'll be wrapping it up here, but I hope by now the benefits to the patients are becoming obvious. And it's not something we take for granted. So again, I mentioned the culture we're dealing with. We're going from the individual success to now team success. That is a cultural change. There is now this did happen in Boston. This is a Harvard Business Review. Had nothing to do with healthcare, but I was fascinated. I have become a student of what makes a network work and what makes a network not work. All right? So what are the attributes? So I've been studying this, and I really was intrigued by this. This is an ecosystem of shared value. What that means is, what if we could create a resource by coming together of different stakeholders? In our case, the stakeholders are patients, researchers, the clinicians, administrators, payers. They're all stakeholders involved in healthcare. What if they were to come together and build this resource, this information resource, to exchange information? So everybody's looking at the same evidence. And our social issue is cancer, but that's collective impact. When you have different stakeholders that could benefit from building something that no one stakeholder can do, that's creating an ecosystem of shared value through collective impact. Shared value because every stakeholder benefits, including society. So that's why I was so intrigued. So this is, this is my illustration or attempt thereof of what this national or even international global research system would look like. So it is information exchange, but you can see we've highlighted it on who the stakeholders are. And patients, obviously, first, but you can start seeing different hospitals are involved, pharmaceutical companies, research centers, insurers. What if we were to all be looking at the same data, the same evidence? Wouldn't that make paying for something? That's what payers always ask. What's the evidence that this is going to work? You're looking at the same data, right? And you can have a logical discussion. This is where we need to go. So, Again, so a single information system built by an agreement, an alliance of multiple stakeholders coming together to build something that no one stakeholder could build. That's the information exchange. For us, it's ORIEN. And then different portals to look at that data. This is where we're at and need to be so that we can, again, be able to anticipate and be proactive. So as I just mentioned, this is obviously, we're starting with cancer. It's a huge challenge, but we're starting to see true events, true discoveries being made in a team science orientation, and the ability to be able to begin to predict what a patient will need and anticipate their need and create an option before they actually need it. So what we'd like to go to is total health care. This isn't the only type of illness that can benefit from this approach. Alzheimer's, for example. What if we could bring patients and their families together and follow all patients with Alzheimer's and learn from them what's working and what's not working? Diabetes, cardiac disease. That's where we want to go. And I'm thrilled for Florida because this began in Florida. All right. Thank you very much, and I appreciate it.
Toy back. Christy's going to help me. She's going to be in the back, and I'm going to be in front. For those of y'all who don't know the rules, this is IHMC's new mic. Don't y'all love it? Okay. So when you guys raise your hands, I will toss it to you. And then you got to toss it back to us. But please be careful, because the last time someone pitched like a 90 fastball, almost took my head off. Okay. All right. So
Well, sign them up.
I know. So I see one here in the front. So Ron, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Okay.
A question I've got, how do you handle the legal part of medical records with this?
Excellent. HIPAA, the legal. When a patient consents, they are donating their data. So HIPAA doesn't apply because HIPAA's important when the patient doesn't know their data is being used. All right? In this case, we don't use their data until they tell us we can use their data. So that's how we do that, through consent.
So we're going to go front and then back. Christy's got one in the back.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for that presentation. You noted that there are only 19 centers involved. How do we know whether the local oncology groups here in the villages are participating?
Good. You're right. I wish it were much larger, but there is a ramp rate. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be done on a foundation to build this. And so Moffitt learned a lot during its time in building it, and we've transferred that knowledge, but there's only so much bandwidth that we have to export it. We would like to work with communities, all communities, but it's a matter of just developing the bandwidth to do it and having enough people to help set it up at those communities. But that's exactly our goal. It was, again, this is 4 years ago, so we started with 2 4 years ago. That was Ohio State and Moffitt, and we're at 19 now. And by the way, we're talking about a workforce that's building this of 50 people. We need to grow this.
We have one right here who's had their hand up for a minute.
As a cancer survivor from Moffitt 5 years ago, I'm a little curious of how the nuts and bolts of this work. I can't remember ever signing anything on this company, ORIEN, and I'm very curious, assuming that Moffitt is a participant in this program, how does this work? Do you automatically send something to the doctors and the patients, or do they have to request it, or how does it work?
Excellent question. You're right. Frankly, when we layered we need their consent on it, that creates much more need to hire people to explain what we're trying to do. And frankly, Moffitt enrolls more people into this but we don't reach everybody. I wish we'd reach, you can still sign up, but you're cured. We have developed, in order to try to reach as many people as we can, we are developing that internet consent, and we think that will help enormously. And Moffitt now sends out, when a new patient comes in, they get a bunch of paper describing what they're doing, and part of it says, we have total cancer care. You can consent through the patient portal on the internet. I don't think it was there 5 years ago, though. So those are the challenges. The doctor, yes, they do. Does the doctor get a report that their patient is in? Yes, they do. But not all of them respond. We need to work on that.
Hello. Are patients like me mostly related by our genomes, or is it by the molecular biology of the tumor? Or are those two also very linked together?
Excellent question. So the similarity of patients like me or whoever, we use it both on clinical data, in other words, lung cancer of a 50-year-old who smoked X, that's all on the clinical data, so we look at the similarities there. And then your specific question about the biologic similarity, it's, the genotype that we get of the genome is done both on normal and tumor. And we make a comparison between the normal genome, your normal genome, and what the tumor genome is, because that gives us evidence of what the target might be. So the degree of similarity is, that we really pay attention to is the difference between normal and tumor and how many people have the same change in their tumor. That's what we're looking for. Excellent question.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful talk. And we were just talking today in our center at University of Florida, I'm a psychiatrist, about how we can get patients in our clinics to consent to using data in the future. We actually are doing a national study now in college mental health and looking at large numbers of patients at University of Florida. One issue we ran into is the Institutional Review Board. And I wanted to ask you how you, in getting people to participate in this wonderful program, approach institutional review boards in order to get agreement to allow academic center patients to participate in your program.
Thank you for that question. Excellent question. So an institutional review board is at each academic research center that looks at any study that's proposed for its ethics and credibility of the science. That's why they're formed. This protocol is now in its 13th year, actually 14th year, and it's been approved. Again, every center is using the exact same protocol and consent. It's been approved by over 35 institutions. I'm just showing you the 19 in ORIEN, and in over 20 different states. So it's past muster. And where we're going though, so that's how it's, and the patient, oh, by the way, the patient advocacy group wrote a white paper that got sent to the IRBs, and the white paper says, we want to do this, get it right, in effect. And when patients talk, that IRBs listen. So there's that. And where we are going, I mentioned the clinical trials. It's one thing to find the best trial for a patient, but what if your center doesn't have it open? So by looking at the patient populations we're serving, we can begin to anticipate the trials we should be opening. And all these 19 centers have agreed to use a single IRB. And that's what the FDA is asking for. All centers have done it. One IRB. One scientific review process instead of 19. And the single master agreement. So again, the culture is changing, and the willingness to do things like that. Thank you for that question.
Yes, ma'am. Here you go. I was wondering if a family member in Kansas has been diagnosed and now needs to go to a cancer center. Is the first question he asks is, are you participating in ORIEN?
Great question. We hope so. Because we think when the patients start asking these questions, the cancer centers are going to come on.
Them to go out of their way to find.
Oh, yeah. Well, I will tell you the closest one to Kansas is University of Colorado. They are a ORIEN member. But we are trying to make this as democratic. We're trying to democratize this entire system so that anybody anywhere can have access to it. But we're still aspirational in that, but we're working toward it.
Thank you. Are you making any distinction between nuclear and mitochondrial DNA in your studies?
Whoa. I'm impressed. Not yet. The mitochondrial DNA is not being studied at this point. That is something we'll need to do. Yeah, wow. I feel like I'm in my thesis defense. Maybe I am in Boston. What is going on?
I have a question. Were these 19 organizations invited, or did they volunteer to become part of your organization? And I noticed that some of the bigger cancer research centers that we see on the media, MD Anderson, Mayo, Johns Hopkins, Cleveland Clinic, are not included. Were they invited, did not want to participate, or have they not yet been invited?
We invite, but we also we get called. And so it's a combination of someone contacting us, we want to join, and us obviously inviting. I will tell you, why does someone not want, how do I say this? We are having more conversations with some of those that you just mentioned now. But we had to hit a little critical, I can understand that. I mean, people are, it's a lot of effort to join this, and you have to, so I think, and there are other options that one could consider in terms of networks.
Is it a case where they want to just go on their own?
Sometimes.
As versus become a group? Because
right.
This, to me, would provide a nationwide, worldwide database, because those folks at those institutions are very progressive
right.
in what they've been doing for the last 30 years or whatever,
right.
more than that. So they have a wealth of information
absolutely.
To share, which to me would be beneficial for the population in general.
Right, I totally agree. But remember I was talking about, the challenge isn't so much technological, it's social, it's cultural. We're pushing on the buttons of academic culture.
More proprietary.
Yeah, in some ways.
Want to continue in their own backyard.
That is, but and I was a dean of a medical school, so I get to say this. It is broken in terms of how we incentivize. We need to be, the incentives need to be, are you participating in impactful research, as opposed to when did you get your last RO1 or whatever.
Right here.
Hi. Do you have any data on any of your success stories of maybe someone whose standard of care was changed as a result of something that you discovered from all this data?
Oh yeah, I showed you 2 papers. We've got literally hundreds of papers that have used this system. But I'll give you sort of an anecdote of how this system was used. One of our docs at Moffitt was seeing a patient with breast cancer who also had multiple sclerosis. And one of the therapies, drugs they wanted to use, had effects on nerves, peripheral nerves. And she was concerned that she might exacerbate the multiple sclerosis with some of these agents. And so her question, she went to the database and said, how many patients with breast cancer received this drug that was effective but had peripheral nerve damage? and also had multiple sclerosis. There were 3 patients in the system that had breast cancer and multiple sclerosis and had received the drug, and none of them had exacerbation of the disease, of the side effect. And she felt in good. She had evidence that she could pursue the use of that drug. So that's point of care using the data system. Great question.
Hi there. I've got a 3-part question. How is ORIEN funded? Part 2, I was interested there was no international collaboration going on. And if you're all about collaboration, why aren't you participating with whatever databases they're keeping at MD Anderson and the other cancer institutes?
We're talking. I'm going to go in reverse order of your questions. We are in discussions. We're in discussions, and with all of the big ones, to be honest with you. And what you may see is a network of networks form. And I'm not sure that's bad, because if you have different efforts that are trying to build these networks, and your learning curve is faster when you start sharing, if you're willing to share lessons learned in the development of your network. And ultimately, and this is what Biden was pushing in his, if you're familiar with his moonshot, is, okay, these are great that these cancer centers are coming together. Will you start sharing, and will you actually, not only lessons learned, but the data, and that slide I showed you with the common central data system could be the network of networks where all the networks are contributing. And that's the kind of discussion that is happening. The second, international. We are in discussion with several countries that you have to sign NDAs and all those sort of things. But we are discussing different countries joining the system. Funding. Yes. The funding is through different pharmaceutical companies primarily. They have access to the data that's de-identified. They can't trace the data. And patients who consent, it says we will be sharing data with pharmaceutical companies. So patients are allowing that. Most of the so we created a pre-competitive space, though. So all pharma that work with us have to agree that everybody gets to look at this data. And I'll give you an example. One of the companies, when we were just starting this, the first company came on board and was telling me what kind of data they needed. And they said, what do you need? And I said, when drug company Y comes to me and says, we have this new drug, we think it hits this target, how many patients in your database express this target and would be eligible for our study? And the leader of the company said, so you want us to pay for the data that company is going to use to match for their trial? I said, yeah. And it took him about 10 seconds, and he said, you're right. That created a pre-competitive space for everybody. Now everybody is looking at it, but in a de-identified, essentially HIPAA system. And we presented this to the FDA. Their response was, what took you so long? Because that's exactly what they would hope we would create. Yes, sir.
Being a vet as well as being a doc, is there any change how you deal with the federal government in terms of funding with respect to the vets as well as in private care, in private practice?
Excellent. So as I mentioned, Walter Reed's in, and so the active military is in. We are in discussions, we're doing a pilot now with the Veteran Administration, because what we're trying to do is create a continuum for active military all through veteran status. And it's working with a VA to us is no different than working with an academic center. But the VAs do tend to partner with academic centers, so we're working through that system of VAs associated with academic centers. And the protocol is now open, and we're learning how to do it, to be frank. VA, the VA's got its own rules, and so we're having to do our best to accommodate those rules. But that is, I'm very excited about that, frankly, to be able to follow someone who's been active military and all the way through. I think we're going to learn a great deal, such as were there events that may have predisposed them to given cancers, et cetera. That's, yeah, thank you for that.
There was someone up here, yes, that had their.
There are many pharmaceutical companies. There are lots of small pharmaceutical companies that do not necessarily have multiple drugs, but they have promising therapies.
Right.
How do you, as an organization, get through that? Because there are lots of those out there who are not getting looked at
Right.
because the big pharmas are kind of not investing in them or what have you.
Got it. That's a great question. It's sort of a, if you will, derivative of the other question, and I should have thought of this. So when we do clinical trial matching from the patient, you have a patient who has this target, what are they eligible for? We don't just screen for the pharma companies we work with. We screen for every trial that exists, including the small biotech companies. And that's what our patients want. They screen for everything. And so we, whether we're working with that pharma or not, we are telling the patient that of every trial that's open, anywhere, sponsored by anybody. That's an important. Thank you.
We're going to have one last question here in the front.
I love the idea that this whole project is very transferable to other aspects of our society. I think that is exciting. And this one is as well. My question is this: are environmental factors in the person's life considered as part of the study?
Great question. Not as much as I would like. It's becoming more focused on given populations that might be at risk of exposure. That's where we're starting. And the general population that we're studying, it's there, but it's not as robust as it should be. It is going. We do have. Well, let me tell you, tobacco smoke is still the major culprit. There's something like 20 questions just on use of tobacco in our patient questionnaire. But there's so many other environmental factors. This is a place where the wearables could become very helpful, so that you're looking at different. Basically, your wearable is sampling the air and/or radiation from the sun. I mean, those are the kind of things, and we are having discussions with manufacturers of wearables to look at environmental influence. But that's an excellent question.
Well, let's show our appreciation to Dr. Dalton for being here tonight.